Clarification of biblical passages that seem to support the doctrine of absolute predestination. How should we interpret those biblical passages that seem to show that man's calling and salvation are strictly predestined? For example, how should we understand Romans 8:29-30? For, those whom he has predestined, he is also predestined, and those whom he has predestined, he is also called, and those whom he has called, he is also justified, and those whom he has justified, he is also glorified? Since God is omniscient, he knows who is qualified to be chosen as the central figure in order to bring about the dispensation for the restoration. God, therefore, predestines and calls a person. This person, however, is not predestined to be justified and glorified automatically. To be justified, it must realize its responsibility, and only after being justified can it enjoy the glory of God. This passage from Romans seems to support the theory of absolute predestination only because in this case the Bible does not specifically mention man's part of responsibility. In Romans 9:15-16 we read, "I will use mercy on whom I will use mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion." It depends, therefore, neither on whom he wills nor on whom he runs, but on God who gives mercy. This passage seems to show that man's wishes, hopes, prayers and efforts are useless. Man must defer solely to God's grace. Let us instead examine it more deeply. Based on his pre-knowledge of what he wants to accomplish by dispensation for restoration, God alone chooses the most suitable people for the fulfillment of this, and man's will or efforts cannot affect this divine decision. For example, no one can decide to be born into a particular race, or descend from a particular family. No one can decide where or when to be born. No one can decide to be born with particular abilities. No one can decide any other particularity of one's nature. However, once a person has been chosen, that person's desires, hopes, prayers and efforts determine whether indeed God can use him or her. This passage in the Bible is meant to put emphasis on God's power and grace, to show that God's criterion of choice in what he decides to do with man is something that does not depend on man. Thus, the purpose of this passage is not to deny the role of man's responsibility. In Romans 9:21 it is written, "Is not he the potter master of his own clay, so as to fashion of the same paste a vessel of merit and an ordinary one?" Man, as a creature of God, cannot under any circumstances challenge the will of his Creator who determined the purpose of life for which humanity was created. Therefore, fallen man, who has become a mix of good and evil in himself, who can in the same day live in accordance with God's will, and then also realize Satan's will and desires for his life, who has lost his own value, is certainly not in a position to complain about the treatment he receives from God, who is his only resource for salvation. In Romans 9:10-13 we read that God loved Jacob and hated Esau, from the time they were in the womb, and that Esau, the elder, was to serve his younger brother, Jacob. This kind of God's behavior stems from the fact that God was carrying out his special plan of restoration, through these brothers. The fact that Jacob was loved by God did not mean that he could receive God's grace unconditionally. To actually receive God's love, he had to realize his own responsibility. Although Esau was hated by God, for a special dispensational reason, if he realized his own responsibility, he would also receive the blessing of God's love. Just as God told Cain to do good and reject sin, it means that God also loved Cain and wanted to save him, but even there, in rejecting Cain's offers and accepting Abel's, there was a definite plan of God, dispensational, and to separate the descendants of Adam and Eve from Satan. The belief in absolute predestination therefore stems from a lack of right understanding of the relationship between man's responsibility and God's responsibility in carrying out the divine will. This misunderstanding, unfortunately, however, has led to the belief that God's will is realized only through God's work and to neglect the great importance of man's responsibility. All of this, moreover, stems above all from a lack of right interpretation of biblical facts and events, which will be revealed at the return of the Messiah, the Spirit of truth of which John 14:16 speaks, who will guide us to the complete truth, thanks to the new revelations that God will give to the Lord at the second advent, for all of us. This will make the destruction of the world, spoken of in Revelation, clearly refer to the end of the world of Satan and evil, through the return of the Messiah in our time, and the complete knowledge of God's truth and His ideal of creation.